And we are live. All right. For those of you who will be watching this later on the replay, greetings and salutations to you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Trubbergy, also known as Byron Sidious. And to the folks who will be watching later, who were with Cortex and myself earlier today, doing a little bit more delving into the backrooms mythology. Once again, I apologize for having to abruptly depart from that conversation and from that panel discussion. It's never my intention to abruptly duck out of a show like that, particularly when I agree to come on at the last minute to help try to keep a kind of schedule going as it is. I do apologize, Cortex, for just disappearing the way that I did. But I am thankful that you folks understand that, um, you know, as a family man, I have to tend to family matters first and foremost. And your patience with me and your understanding is greatly appreciated. So, with that stated and on the record, I'm now going to go ahead and float about on the phone here and drop the link to various locations as necessary. Copy the link. First place we drop it into is good old reliable. Paste it. Paste it. And we'll see who our first viewers will be tonight. I suspect it will, with any luck, be Tom stuck in the south, who will be amongst our early arrivals. Tweet, tweet. Go to the Twitter, drop it there. Head on over to Minds, because I enjoy the use of Minds. When it comes to social media, that tends to be the first place I go to these days. Paste in here. There we go. Drop into the groups. Jump in. And again, I know that the start of these streams tend to be a bit ifsy because I'm quiet. I'm looking down at my phone. I'm not paying attention to the screen. I'm not engaging in a ramble or a rant right off the top of the show. But this is, well, I'm amateur hour when it comes to doing these things still. So bear with me, please. And I appreciate your patience, as always. Hey, Tom, how you doing, brother? I said that you would probably, hopefully, be one of the first folks to show up here. How you doing, Tom? And this is part of the problem of going around lots of different social media. Is I've got to bounce around it, pretty much all of them, in order to make sure I get the link posted in various places. And good evening, Raisin Girl. I won't bargain with you. Fix it now. I'm trying, I swear I am. I'm doing the best I can. Yeah, not necessarily true, but the best I can is not all that great. Yeah, I had to take care of the scruff earlier today myself, so I sympathise with that, Tom. drop the link. And so I believe I have dropped the link to those places where I tend to do so. So now I can tend to it, to get to it, ask how folks are doing, and kind of a brief little go over um, about what it is that I intend to ramble on and on about tonight for this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit of shop, the process of constructing narratives. This is something that Galen has kind of been pestering me to talk about for a while, is to try and go about detailing what it is exactly that I do as a storyteller to assemble my narratives and put them together. Yeah, I imagine it does, Tom. Um, I've got one of those trimmers that an electric trimmer. I use that to just buzz down and get it down to an acceptably short level before I just grab a cheap safety razor and then grab Barbasol, lather up, and swick, swack, swick. I'm done in about 5 or 6 minutes. Thankfully, I don't let it grow out to be too much of a bushmaster looking beard. I'm not going for the Grizzly Adams look because, according to my wife, when I do let it grow out too long, I look like an axe murderer. Her words. And it's like, well, wait a minute. When you first met me, I had, and she's like, you know, I could see past that though. Hey there, Sam. How you doing? Good to see you tonight, love. You weren't here immediately at the top of the show, so I just want to say again, I do apologize immensely to the audience or the faithful folks who routinely tune in to watch Cortex on the early days show. Um, I didn't want to dump out on him the way I did, but there was a situation with the boys that required immediate tending to, and they were just getting bonkers. And like I said, their older sister Avery, just she's only 10 years old. She can only handle so much of those boys' nonsense and keep up with one of them at a time. It's like, it's not fair of me to ask her to try and hold those two back from destructive or suicidal nonsense for more than 20 minutes. And if I had been truly honest with myself, and if I had been more fair to Cortex this morning, I would have told him, look, I'm at home with the kids. The wife is heading to work, so it's not like I can keep everything under control here. I know, Tom, you keep telling me duct tape. Strap those kids to the wall, fuck them, secure them in place. But you know, I, I'm dad. I have to do dad. Um, that's who I am. That's what I do. And thank you for your understanding again. I'm just going to really quick highlight that one. Duct tape. But then I'm also going to highlight this because I appreciate the sentiment and I thank you for the understanding, Sam. So, talking a little bit about um, pictures very blurry. I wonder if that's the camera getting smudged or what, or if it's just me because of the lighting in here. I'm not sure. Because, hold on 1 second. Wondering if the diffusion of light might help out some. But otherwise, it could just be because I'm going straight from the webcam on the laptop. I don't have a I don't have a good camera, so a separate USB camera. So I'm using the Potato 8000. This is possibly going to be annoying for a moment. Sorry about that. Um, but yeah, just trying to get that to look a little bit better. Anyhow, I'm not usually too concerned with my appearance on the show. It's more a matter of if you can hear me clearly, if the audio is coming through all right. Because trust me, uh, it matters far more to me that you can hear what I'm saying clearly and make out what I'm talking about. That's far more important than if you can see me. So if you can hear me all right, do let me know that you can hear me just fine. Because as I said, that's far more vital. Sorry. What I do have to drink is water. But anyhow, I know that it may be because I clear my throat a great deal, and I apologize for that. See, I don't know how to muck about too much with the audio settings, but I'll see what I can do in terms of um, microphone. Let's do this. Um, Trying to see if there's a way to adjust the volume so that I'm carrying across more clearly. Again, sorry for the clearing my throat if that is an issue. Volume. All right. Hopefully that will do the trick. Push all the buttons all at one time. Uh, Anyhow, and I'll take the glasses off so that the glare off the screen isn't reflecting back at you folks. Just set those there for the time being. Anyhow, um, stepping into an area that Galen has asked me about a few times, and a couple of other friends and colleagues have inquired about regarding what exactly my process is when it comes to constructing a narrative, whether it be a short story, a longer short story, a novella, or a novel. Um, what I usually end up starting off with is a uh, a very basic outline. Um, Here's the basic book list. Okay, so like here we've got keynotes for a story. Starting off for Five and Dime. Keynotes introducing the basic concept of the premise of the story, the primary characters, the primary protagonist, writing down just a kind of a vague or a basic physical description outline and primary personality characteristics that I want to make sure are laid out consistently throughout the telling of the story, as well as world building concepts when I am working in fantasy, science fiction, or horror, thematic elements that I want to make sure are applied systematically and consistently throughout the story, as well as including any areas or moments where an element that has been consistent throughout the narrative up to a certain point, if there is a rule that is established early on in the narrative, that if I break that rule or alter that rule in some way, shape, or form, that I make certain I have a handwritten note for myself about why that rule is different for this character or this circumstance, what exactly changed to make that rule no longer applicable in this particular instance or in this specific scene. And I try to make certain that all of those concepts remain throughout the story. So that if I have something that appears to be a a procedural break in the narrative, that it can at the very least be explained to myself, even if I'm not relating a full description or explanation to the reading audience. I want to have a note to myself, well, why did this happen? Okay, am I going to explain that in full detail to the audience, or am I going to hint at it and imply why something has changed and leave it up to the readers in order to interpret? Such as, to elaborate, in the story Five and Dime, which I have not begun presenting as yet, either to a live audience or as a recorded audiobook presentation. But in the story of Five and Dime, when a mortal soul dies in the realm that this story takes place within, trying not to give out too many spoilers. Um, when a human being dies in this location, they are reassembled back in a location that is safe to them, but with a brief snippet of an understanding that they just died and they have full knowledge of how they died, what was done to them, what happened to them. And they'll be shaken and afraid, but they won't have any lingering pain or side effects of that death or that maiming or mangling. No visible scarring will be present on them. However, um, in one of the later chapters of the story, the primary character looks down at himself after a sequence in which he is slaughtered by a tiger demon. This demon plunges its claws into his lower abdomen, and the claws dig into the meat and flesh, and they hooks he hooks his hands onto the primary character's ribs and literally rends him open, just splits him in half, and the main character slumps on the ground dead. And when he awakens back home, he's short of breath and gasping and panting and panicking, and he holds his midsection and he pulls up his shirt to discover that he doesn't have any blood on him, but there are still four puncture marks on his flesh that, as he's watching his midsection, they fill back in with whole flesh and meat, and he is whole again. And he's questioning, wait a minute, why why every other time that I've been slaughtered have I come back to consciousness with no visible sign that anything had just happened to me? Yet this time, I'm seeing evidence that something just happened to me. I can remember what happened to me, just like every other time, but every other time, I didn't see myself being reconstructed. Yes, Sam. It's there's kind of a there's a leftover feeling of pain and panic and terror, but the actual physical pain is not there upon reconstruction and reassembly. And while I have a note to myself, where is it? Okay. While I have myself a note here regarding this phenomenon, why, on a very rare occasion, a human may experience something similar to this moment. While I have a note here explaining it to myself, I only ever really hinted at it, at the explanation for it, in a later chapter in the story. And the explanation effectively boiling down to, if you were completely taken off guard by the suddenness and the savagery of how you were killed in this realm, you would there would only be the briefest moment of loss of consciousness between when you die and when you recover consciousness back in your safe location, or your start point, as it were, because the brutality of it was so swift that your consciousness never actually fully blinks out. Rather than shutting down and then booting back up, it's more like he blinked. His eyes didn't stay shut as long as normally they should have, and he found himself awake again, witnessing his own narration. But I have a lot of these notes for a story that ultimately went through and was drafted up, edited, repurposed, expanded, torn apart, re edited, redrafted, and put back together, and only recently finally cleaned up and prepared ultimately for an eventual presentation. And this is just part of the process. This is just part and parcel of what goes into constructing a novel for me. Is I have to have a system outline for world building and mechanics that are going to be throughout my given narrative, my given story, whether it be a series or a standalone story, a standalone novel. It's vital to keep notes on hand for the mechanics of the story. It's extremely important for for a series, and oh yeah, I cannot even imagine what that must have been like, Sam. I do remember you mentioning before that you had been in a coma. Um, when it comes to sorry, establishing a series, I talked about briefly this notebook that I keep around on last night's show, where I've got notes on the Amelia City stories. I've got notes on the Kathy Potts Realms of Fairy stories. I've got Tamalarian Tales Fourth Age series notes for various characters, storylines, overarching storylines that tie from one novel into another, and developments throughout the realms of Tamalaria that should see passive mention and notification and updating throughout further narratives. When you are world building in that fashion, much as much as the great late Sir Terry Pratchett did with the Discworld novels, each of those stories was its own self-contained narrative, but uh, they all gave to the further production and development of the realms of Discworld. Um, you don't have to read the books in order to see that there are overlapping storylines and character developments throughout the various novels of that series of books. It's not a chronological series, but it is a series with a great deal of detail and world building that needs to remain consistent. So you have to have guidebooks for yourself of this sort. You have to have drop lists and outlines and notations to refer to in order to make certain you're not stepping on your own feet and tripping over yourself to stay consistent. And that is the most fundamental element of story construction for me. It starts with the base outline and the drop list. Now, your base outline covers things like I mentioned with world building mechanics and the implementation thereof throughout the story. Key plotline elements that will be important to touch upon from one point to another, and concepts that are perhaps unique to the world that you're constructing for your fiction, or that may be universal to several stories. The drop list is a secondary thing, but it's very important for
I only have
some folks.
100 pages left until I finish my book.
Oh, good.
I
Good,
started
good.
on page 27 and I got to page 91
Damn, kid.
because the book is 120 pages long.
Not a problem, Shade. Always drive safe. Better safe than sorry. You gotta stay, particularly in this fucking state with the weather nonsense we've been dealing with here. Um, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Shade and I share a state of residence here in Minnesota. Um, but the drop list it's not so much it's not a chapter by chapter breakdown of everything that's going to happen throughout the story, throughout a given novel. Um, a drop list is more giving a kind of a general sense of what's going to take place at various high and low points of the narrative. Um, for instance, here we've got chapter two. I've got broken down chapter two of this story. I've got broken down into six major paragraph summaries. And these paragraphs are summaries or synopses of the scenes that will compose chapter two of this story. It's not a point by point, blow by blow, exact sketch of what's going to happen throughout the story. It merely covers the basic concepts, the tone and flow of the conversations and dialogues that will take place amongst the various characters that feature in the chapter, and presents certain mechanical instances of mechanics that should be laid out or highlighted throughout that particular given chapter. And that's what a drop list is for. It's kind of it's a slightly more specific outline, almost like in television or especially in animation. They have these things called storyboards, where they give kind of the broad strokes in a still visual format of the characters get involved in a scene, what they'll be doing, and the tone of conversation. And there will be a few, just a handful of specific phrases or quotations of specific events that you want to happen that you know belong in a certain chapter or at a certain point of that chapter. Not a whole lot. Usually, I reserve for myself in these drop lists perhaps one specific detail to include at this point in the chapter, at this point in the story. or a detail here, or an event here, or a combat sequence that will occur, way here down near the end of a chapter. It's relying on these handwritten notes is part of my process. It's practice for when I actually get into writing out the story. Between the handwritten notes and the final product, there will be a lot of changes. This is inevitable. But this is also why when I am doing my drop lists, my outlines, I tend to try to leave a little bit. I didn't do it here, and I should have. I tend to try to leave myself a decent amount of space between paragraphs in my drop list notations, so that when I do come across a spot that I need to alter, or I discover, oh well, it would flow better for the story or for the character, this would make better sense, or make the story more engaging and gripping, or this would be better for the plot development or the mechanics of the story. So I work the better parts in as I'm drafting. I'll go back in here to the drop notes outlines, and I'll make a physical handwritten note about the alteration, usually in tribal asterisk form. I'll jot that down and then make a note of the change that I made during the drafting, and I'll try to make a note of which draft I was working on when I made this adjustment. So when I'm going back through later, comparing what I hope will be my final draft, my final version of a given short story, novella, or novel, I can take a look at and see, okay, well, here's where I was when I was first dreaming up this story, and here's how I changed that, why I ended up finishing where I did. And I can try to kind of measure the gap of difference between where I started and where I ended up, where I finished with the story as presented. For someone who's a bit pedantic about these things as I am, this is of vital importance because I like to make certain that the changes that I do make are actually in service to the story and not just in service to my own whims. The story is more important than my ego, always. And so that's just a little bit of chatter about my process as a storyteller. It may seem dull or very workmanlike and mechanical, but this is how I work. This is how I operate. The concepts, the ideas, they come sporadically, scattershot. I'm very rarely inspired by or influenced by the same thing twice. Oftentimes, just a stray thought or something I'm watching on television, or a line I hear in a film, or something I see in a cartoon, something I read in a book. More often than not, I find a great deal of inspiration in ideas or concepts in other genre fiction stories, especially a neat concept that just gets left flat and doesn't get picked up and developed fully to its greatest potential. I find those concepts tremendously fertile ground to work upon. The whole five and dime thing, while it started off as a collaborative project with a couple of other folks, their original concept was just to start the story in this other realm without really explaining how we got there. The rationale behind the main character ending up in that realm, I decided, well, what if this is what happened to put him into that realm? And the other two lads who were initially tangentially attached were like, okay, yeah, we could work with that. That's interesting enough. I, however, thought that was a driving factor. And that's what made me dive headlong into telling that story and developing it. And again, that story ultimately ended up being Five and Dime. Still not sure if I'm going to end up presenting that as a live reading series here through live stream, or if I'm going to pre record audio with still images like I do with most of my other projects. Not sure yet. But that is that's a brief, well, for me anyhow, brief breakdown of my creative process, um, going through and constructing a narrative. How is everybody who is here with me tonight doing? Figured I'd ask before, leave a little open room for some banter before I segue on to the next area of interest that I wanted to touch upon tonight. Sorry, I'm so used to hitting the mute button when I'm on panel with Cortex and Mr. Reactions and Reviews. That when I'm not talking, I hit the mute just now, and it's like, well, wait a minute, I'm the only putz on here right now. It's a remix. Tom, Galen, Shade, if you blokes are still in the show, let me know with any questions, comments, snarky remarks, witty observations, or perhaps, you know, leave a comment or say something that will take me off on one of my normal tangents that goes completely aside from what I had planned to talk about or discuss this evening. I don't mind being pulled in different directions sometimes because it's not all about me. It's it's about the folks who it's about the folks who actually come to have these conversations or to listen to me blather on. No worries, Shade. No worries. Not worried about you being late. It's better. It's preferable that you're in one piece. And the nice thing about the fact that these streams are recorded and kept on my YouTube channel is that you can always go back at some point later on, skip past the quiet early part, the first few minutes when I'm not saying anything because I'm sat here looking down at my phone because I'm sharing the link to the show, you know, so that you can blow past that part where I'm putzing around and start where I actually, begin the program, as it were. Because otherwise, it's just you looking at this chump looking down at his phone. Are you talking about 3D printing, Tom? That is one of those hobbyist kind of things. I wish I had the time or money and inclination because I got to tell you, the number of fantasy miniatures I would print up for myself would be fantastic and bleed away my money and time. Okay. Yeah, I wish I had had the resources to have a 3D printer and do up miniatures or try to create figurines of some of the characters that I've created over the years. And shit, some of the characters that I've read in the various fictions I've read over the years would be great. Like Anomander Rake from Stephen Erickson's Tales and Malatan Books of the Fallen series. I imagine he would look, for some reason, whenever I read those books, in every scene that Anomander Rake shows up in, um, I mentally visualize him as looking like like an anime version, like a dark anime version of the character Magus from the game Chrono Trigger. Fucking love that game and love that character. Absolutely fantastic. Yeah, it gets to you. Okay. See, I don't know what the difference is between a resin printer or a filament printer. I've no idea. I just know I've seen some fantastic figurines made with 3D printing. Um, Obviously, I missed something. Play Holler Boys. I feel like a dunce, like I missed a reference. That's not surprising though. There's a lot of pop culture references that go right over my head. Much like, Peanut when Jeff Dunham does the. He's another stand up comedian I rather enjoy over the years. Okay, okay. I wasn't sure. Again, there's plenty of references that go completely over my head. Um, any questions, any comments, any concerns before I move into or segue into the next part of tonight's pre-planned rambling, which is diving into some territory that, once again, I know will be much more of interest to my friends Galen and Cortex. Cortex isn't here right now, I don't think. Not sure if he's either getting some rest before heading to work, or if he's already at work, or if he's in another show, or what have you. One way or the other, brother, I hope if you hear this later on, that you consider some of the things I'm going to bring up in just a few minutes. Yeah, and these days I have I have both of those things happen quite a bit, Tom. Um, because oftentimes, um, one of the boys will hit me in the crotch and that'll knock me down, and then the other boy running through the room will jump over me, so he goes over my head, so I'm getting knocked down and having it over my head. Um, what does that symbol mean, Galen? The start to finish process. Well, I always start with. Um, okay, it just must be the fact that my eyesight is shit. Um, the start of the process for me is always a concept or a question, an idea, a thought. Um, one of the one of my greatest stop starts, and by that I mean a story that I have started and that I've stopped numerous times, um, was a story that the initial concept or working title I was going with was The Stone Ones. and this was going to be a kind of dystopian future setting story. Um, the basic concept being that humanity has been reduced to living inside of these kind of domed shelters because sunlight in the world that they inhabit is literally lethal after exposure to it within a few seconds, within about half a minute. If human flesh is exposed to sunlight for more than 30 seconds, a person will just die because of solar radiation. And so over time, mankind had noticed that, the power of solar radiation was getting more and more devastating to them, and was somehow also causing mutations amongst the wildlife and the plant life of the world they inhabit. So they constructed these protective domes on the planet. And over time, mankind ultimately got kind of shunted themselves into living in these domes, these domed cities and plantations for the use of agriculture and growing their own food. But over the course of time, some kind of life forms ended up developing or evolving out in the wild, and these creatures are known as trolls. They have this, thick stone-like flesh, excrescence all over them. These giant boulder-like creatures, these savage, basically giant rock gorillas, and they try to breach the domes. They attack humanity, and over time, humans have constructed these kind of power armor suits, and they are referred to these soldiers who are trained in the use of the armor suits, and these giant powered sledgehammers and rail spike launchers are referred to as hunters. And the concept, the basic world building concepts there, I liked the idea of playing with that concept, that set of ideas, but I kept not really figuring out how was I going to get this in and use these interesting elements to tell a story worth telling. And I kept just coming up against a brick wall and thinking, well, these are kind of cool ideas, but how do I actually put them together into something that is a strong or interesting narrative? And I set those concepts aside for a long time. And about a year and a half ago, I was going through my old outline notebooks, and I found one that had these concepts and mechanics written down in one of my older notebooks. I said, "Oh yeah, the stone ones. I never got back to this." And I was flipping through my notes, and I recognized what I was missing was a character. The stories that we have come to know and love throughout the ages. Plot is vital, yes. The story, the events that take place are important, yes. But those events happen to a person. You have to have a character to connect to and to pilot through these events. Without a character to attach to the significance of these events, it's difficult to construct a story and get all the way through it to convey your message and to entertain your audience. And I didn't have a character, or rather, I had outlined a couple of and detailed a couple of basic characters who would be involved in the story, but neither of the characters that I had outlined had anything that really seemed to tie me to them. I didn't care about them. And until you have a character who you care about as a storyteller, or who you can see putting through the gauntlet of struggle and consequence throughout a given plot line, until you have a character to put into that story and take them on that journey, you're not going to be able to tell the story. So you have to have the character constructed within the mechanics of the world building you have established, understand the mechanics of how the world that character resides in are going to function, not only for them, but for everyone that they come into contact with as well. Figure out the traits, both of personality and physicality, that belong to this character that will remain consistent throughout that story, and the ones that will be altered by the events of the story itself and how significant those alterations will be. Once you have all of that outlined, then you can begin to work on your drop list. And your drop list is where the bulk of your real foundational work will be, because you are setting up the structure, the beat points, the bullet points, the highlight moments and scenes are going to have a skeletal structure upon which the details hang. You need that skeletal structure, or the rest of it's just going to crumble and fall apart. When in doubt, you can always go back to your outline and drop list to remind yourself, here's what I started with. Your outline and drop list should be the core fundamentals of your story. And everything else you do is just fleshing it out, giving it life, making certain that it can function when it's all put together. Um, Having gone through all of that, I'm going to take a moment to grab a drink. Again, sorry for the long winded ramble there. And so now, finally, going to segue into the last bit of tonight's show. Galen, I am glad you're still here, and I do hope that eventually my friend Cortex will get a chance to listen to this or watch this show. Because there's a character who I'd like to bring up, a character in fiction who I have a strong affinity toward, a character who I greatly appreciate for various reasons, and a character who I feel has been grievously mistreated, particularly by more recent writers in his particular realm. I am referring to the character known as Frank Castle, the Punisher of Marvel Comics. Now, Galen and I have had some disagreements back and forth over the last few years about Frank, about who he is, what he stands for, what kind of concepts of personality one can extrapolate from his adventures, from his brutalities, from his methods. But I should like to say that Frank Castle is more vital than most people think. Um, there are very few comic book protagonists who inspire as much loathing and groaning than the man in the skull emblazoned combat vest, better known as the Punisher. He's often branded an overzealous barbarian and a sadistic or irresponsible lunatic. But Frank Castle is a long standing whipping boy of several kinds of media watchdogs and parents groups, and those concerned that his stories glorify violence, especially gun violence. There are some dewy eyed optimists out there who demand that comic books should more rightly return to the good old days of pure good versus pure evil, to do away with the shades of grey and nuance and to send them to bed without supper, to say, no, no, nuance, no, no, we can't have characters who are possessed of both positive and negative traits. We can't have anti heroes. They're just bad guys who justify their horrific actions with their own ethos or creed. They're still bad people. There's a reason that in comic books they're called vigilantes. These are not necessarily nice people, but they do what dirty work needs to be done sometimes. Um, Hold on one moment. Sorry about that. um, but anyhow, moving on. I've got some pre-written comments. So, um, the ender of certain peoples, yes, by all means, you may go that road and compare him that way. And actually, I've got a section that I wrote here. What have we got here in these notations? War Gods. That actually is the title of one of my sections of notation there, Galen. War Gods. Some parallels that we could definitely draw between Frank and certain war gods in various mythologies throughout history. Comic book enthusiasts of every stripe will debate at great length the merits of this character or that one. They'll argue exhaustively over who would win in a fight and discuss the various ways in which their favorite characters are integral to the sub universe to which they belong. Um, and yes, exactly, Galen, there is an aim and a hope for him that he may eventually be able to bring the cyclical nature of the terrors of the violence of life to a closure so that something better can arise from it. I think one of the tragedies of the character is that he may very well not ever get to that end of the cycle. And I think Frank well knows that. He may never survive to see it, but he will put in the work towards that new beginning in the hopes that he can get there. Um, I'm happy to count myself an old school comic book fanboy of Once Upon a Time. I was never as deeply invested as some folks you see on YouTube who can quote comic series and issue and exact character and who was writing the series at that time and who was doing the inking and the principal illustration and who was the primary distributor. Although we all know Diamond Comics did most of the distributing for a very very long time, or Diamond Publishing. They were doing the distribution for Marvel, DC, Top Cow, Dark Horse, whoever. Most of the comic book industry for a very long time. They had a kind of a tight monopoly squeeze on their bollocks for a very long time. But amongst my favorite characters in comic book mythologies have been Frank Castle, Dark Hawk for a while, Ghost Rider, Slapstick, who was a limited edition character, had a run back in the 90s. He was this kind of wacky, antics, physics defying cartoon character. He was literally a living cartoon character. Um, Death's Head 2 from Marvel UK. I really liked that series for a while. Back when I was 14, 15 years old, collecting Death's Head 2. And my absolute favorite villain from DC Comics, Jonathan Crane, the Scarecrow. Um, don't don't get me wrong. Like most folks who enjoy the detective comics and the works and adventures of Batman, I have an appreciation for the Joker as a character, as a villain. Sure, but I prefer Crane. I have a soft spot for the Master of Fear. For the purposes of our discussion here tonight, we're going to focus on Castle. We're going to focus on Frank. Um, his origin story has been revisited on several occasions throughout Marvel Comics continuity and the MCU and all of that, and various overarching reboots of the entire Marvel Comics line. But there's always a singular common element that is shared amongst all of these versions of Frank, that he is a longtime veteran soldier or Marine who witnesses the murder of his family at the hands of warring underworld criminals, gangsters, and goons, and that he himself gets wounded in their crossfire as a result, and that he barely survives, but he's broken. He's essentially broken by the horror of losing his loved ones the way he did. And enraged and bent on revenge, initially, Frank deals swift and terrible repayment to these crimes and to these criminals, painting the environment with their blood and brains and guts and bones and spent spent shell casings. But as you well know, it didn't end there for the Punisher. And frankly, we should all be grateful for that. In the Netflix adaptation of Marvel's The Punisher, the character of David Lieberman, known as Microchip, delivers a line during an argument with Frank that's actually a paraphrasing, a rephrasing, an adjustment to a line that was initially said to Frank in Spider Man comic books. Because Frank Castle first appeared in The Amazing Spider Man. He was a villain, he was a mercenary who, if I recall correctly, not a mercenary. He was a vigilante, but he assumed that Spider-Man, because he was costumed, that he must be some kind of villain, some kind of criminal. So he was originally trying to take out Spidey. He was originally trying to kill Peter Parker, but many years later, the development of the character, and this was long after Frank had his own series. There was an exchange between the two of them. This was shortly after, I think, either the second Punisher War Journal limited series or after War Zone, one of those two limited series where it was an extremely down to earth, kind of brutal Frank Castle story where he was clearing out gangbangers and drug dealers from the streets of New York City. And after a particularly heated gun battle with one of these gangs, Frank had been wounded, and he was tending to his injuries in the back of his battle van, surrounded by all these corpses that he had made of, formerly living human upright people. And Spider-Man comes to the scene, or he's swinging over the city, and he sees all these bodies, and he sees the battle van. Hello, Ed. And Spider-Man swings down into the alley to check up on Frank because he recognizes the battle van, and he's trying to ask Frank what happened, and Castle won't say anything to him. He's binding up his wounded arm. He's reloading his magazines. He's checking over his equipment, not saying a fucking word to Spider-Man. And finally, Spider-Man says, "You know what? Fine. It seems like all you," to quote Spider-Man, "it seems like all you have inside of you is a war, Frank. And you're not even at war with a real enemy. You're at war with an idea. And and in this one moment, Frank turns and looks at Spider-Man, looks down at his equipment, and then he looks back to Spider-Man and tells him, "Yeah, you're probably right. But what else am I supposed to do? There's a war here that has to be fought. Someone has to fight it. Better me than you. You're a good kid. Now get the hell out of my van." And he kicks Spider-Man, literally kicks him in the chest. Now, if you know anything about Spider-Man, you know as well as I do that that kick could not have actually thrown Peter from the van if he had not been willing to be kicked out of the van. By all rights, if he had just planted his feet and stood firm, Frank probably should have broke his fucking leg. But, and this is one of those rare instances where I am going to give um, much more credence to the character of Spider-Man, who I have for years thought less of than I did Frank. Peter could have just ripped him apart right there and used might is right rationale, but he didn't. He understood what Frank was going through, at least in part. He if he didn't accept the rationale, he could come to terms with and comprehend why Frank was doing what he was doing. He didn't agree with his methods, he didn't approve of his methods, but he understood why it was being done. And Galen, I have, since you first mentioned that story arc, gone back and actually um, read that storyline with Spider-Man becoming the punishing spider because you sent it to me. Not a problem, Shade. You do what you got to do, brother. Um, Moving into some of my comments in the section I have written down here, headed War Gods, which actually that whole diatribe I just went through was actually under this section. Um, Throughout the history of humanity, various pantheons of worship, beyond counting, have incorporated aspects of the human spirit and humanity as a whole into these sort of god figures. We've got they're oftentimes aspects that represent facets of humanity's various primary archetypes and behavior mechanisms or tribes. Thank you, Shade. I'm going to highlight this because I have, again, from some of the material you've sent me, Galen, I have seen that. And Shade, we'll talk again when we get the chance. It's always good to check in with your friends. Um, but throughout history, we've had these characters that represent facets of human nature. The Greeks, for instance, um, well, hold on one second. Let me go back a little bit. One of these aspects of human nature that has oftentimes, almost always, found a representation as a terrifying and ferocious character is the persistence of mankind's tendency towards war. Evening, Brooke. How you doing, dear? Good to see you. The Greeks had Ares as their god of war, one of the sons of Zeus, who was said in the Iliad, quote, to be the god most hateful to him. to Zeus. Um, and this is perfectly in keeping with the Punisher, a man of violence and vitriol, who is much despised by both the reading public and the characters who inhabit the Marvel pantheon and mythology. He is viewed with great scorn and disdain. Um, and there's a great many people amongst the human populace in Marvel Comics who think he is nothing short of some kind of walking death machine and little else, that he has very little other purpose. Um, but there's also those people in Marvel comic universe who just sort of feel a sense of ambivalence towards him. They accept what he is, they accept that he's there, but they're not about to go out of their way to show any support for the fellow because he is, according to some characters in Marvel, a brutal jackass. The Roman war god, Mars, was viewed with a much more paternal, sort of guardian type role over the society of Rome and um, in their pantheon of gods. He acted more like a sort of overall war, willing to go to war in the service of protecting his people. And this is, in its own way, like a paternal role, something that could also be paralleled to Frank Castle, who has acted as a ruthless rescuer and protector of the powerless, especially in Garth Ennis's Marvel Max run story arc, The Slavers. In that arc, Frank discovers a sex trafficking ring operating out of Queens, and he proceeds to massacre the enforcers and grabmen of this ring. Following information up he gathers from the girls who he frees and the thugs who he interrogated before he executed them, he moved his way through this organization, occasionally dropping anonymous tips to law enforcement when he saw that there was no way and no means for him to minimize collateral damage if he were to openly engage and infiltrate safe houses or holding locations. He would contact law enforcement anonymously to best serve the rescue of these girls, even though he wanted to kill these men. Killing them was not the sole focus, it was saving the people who could not save themselves. Um, and one of my favorite parts of that story was um, near the end of the slaver's story arc. He's confronted by, I want to say it was, I can't remember who it was immediately. Oh, wait, yes, I do. Um, he is confronted by Carol Danvers, who essentially tells him, "You are a fucking monster. You have murdered all these men. You've committed such slaughter, such wanton destruction. You should you should be at the Hague for war crimes." And Frank just kind of gives her this sidelong look and a half grin and says, "Really? I should be locked up for saving these girls? Where were you and your spandex wearing friends? You were off saving the world, stopping galactic intruders from decimating the entire planet. But at what point did any one of you decide to get down here in the dirt and save the most powerless, helpless people who could not defend themselves? You were too busy off, exchanging blasts of power or energy from your eyeballs with creatures that would wipe the absolute floor with me and not even blink. But just like they wouldn't blink to destroy me, you didn't move a muscle to save any of these girls, so I don't want to fucking hear it. And she actually just kind of paused and said, "Okay, you know what? You're right." And she left him alone. This is one of the few times that Frank was able to completely dress down one of the super powered entities of the hero variety when they didn't try to make him eat his own words or eat the ground. He just very effectively said, "Yeah, I know you could destroy me without so much as a thought, but the thought you don't bother to spare me because I'm just a human with no powers or abilities, it's the same level or lack of thought you give to these other normal human beings who are constantly being victimized. You don't do a damn thing for them." And many of the other street level heroes, like Daredevil, or even in his degree, Spider Man, they'll deal with these creeps and these cretins, and they'll have them locked up and thrown into jail, put through the criminal justice system, a system that Frank no longer believes can stand up to the sheer volume of human nastiness, deceit, deception, and power hunger. That the system is so rotted that it needs something like him. The criminal justice system is infected, and while he's not the perfect cure for it, he certainly can act as an antibiotic to beat back the corruption for a time. Returning for a moment to mythological ties, in Norse mythology, Odin Allfather, patron of the gods of Asgard, viewed war as a necessity, both for conquest and for protection. However, it is perhaps more appropriate to liken Castle to Fenrir sometimes, the great giant wolf prophesied to devour Odin during Ragnarok, held in place just barely by a mighty dwarf crafted chain. Castle, too, has a chain. He will almost always be limited by his humanity. Returning for a moment to Greek mythology, we can see ties between Castle and a goddess known as Nemesis, a goddess of revenge, who is often described in tales involving her as, quote, merciless and inescapable. Her name literally translated to, quote, to give what is due, which is a close parallel to Castle's general mission statement. And by general mission statement, I'm going to turn to a different notable quote from this notebook from the other day. Um, Give me just a moment and I will come to it. Ah, yes. Notable quote from Frank Castle. This isn't about justice. It isn't about trying to put the world into some kind of balance. This ain't making things right. This is punishment, and I am here to deliver it. Frank Castle, Punisher, War Journal. And again, Galen, we may be touching upon that deeper desire of Frank Castle's to see the violence, the cycle of violence brought to an end. Because when Fenrir does devour Odin Allfather at the end of days in the greatest end of battles of Ragnarok, the blood of Odin Allfather, and this is in accordance to some of the interpretations and translations of the legend of the Epic of Ragnarok. It is said that the blood that is spilled from Fenrir and Odin when Tyr, son of Odin, tears the wolf in half, and in the process, though he saves his father, also wounds him. But that blood seeps into the roots of the Yggdrasil, the world tree, thus allowing the tree to give birth to a new world in the wake of the end of the old world. And that may be a mythological tie symbolically that we can hold on to. That the hope for Frank is he is that rabid animal just waiting to break free of his chain, his constraint, and do the damage that needs to be done. But he does it because it has to be done to break the world that is already so rotted and corrupted free of that rot, to make it free of that corruption. But I have yet to see Frank's character really utilized in a way, especially nowadays, that would aim towards that. It was Baldur, sorry, my mistake. I was thinking it was Tyr who was reborn, that he ripped open Fenrir and was reborn in the spilled blood of his father and the wolf in the roots of the Yggdrasil. Then again, that just could be from the translation that I have upstairs. Different scholars have different translations. Unfortunately, this is where you have to try and read as many different interpretations as you can get your hands on. I've only got a couple upstairs. Um, Moving into another facet or element of Frank, all that rage. The Punisher is frequently criticized as being a very two dimensional character, a tough guy anti hero who is little more than a heavily armed edge lord. Such a dismissive description does very little to address his depth of character when he's handled by a talented writer at the helm, and it completely devalues his intellectual or tactical skill set. Think about this. We've seen the memes on Facebook, on Twitter, and in other places online of having any comic book character versus Batman with X amount of time prep or preparation. And it seems like in most of these meme war scenarios, the edge is almost always given to Batman because it's broadly accepted amongst the comic book loving public that Batman, with enough time to prepare for his opponent, will almost always figure out a way to best them in the long run. Bearing in mind that Bruce Wayne has access to all kinds of equipment and materials and weaponry and gadgetry that most other people won't have access to. Yet, oftentimes, even with that prep time, Batman barely manages to hold his own or win, even in these fan made theorems and setups. If you gave Frank Castle the level of resources that Batman has at his disposal, with the prep time equivalent, who do you think is going to do more damage? I find this a fascinating idea. I personally am not sure that that would be a good idea because we've seen what happens when Frank gets a hold of the War Machine combat suit. Now, sadly, there were some piss poor writing decisions made there in that storyline where they made Frank be brainwashed by Hydra when he took control of uh, the War Machine suit, and so he went on a killing spree and rampage against innocent people and law enforcement and the military. Were he not possessed of that brainwashing, can you imagine the amount of damage Frank would have done to the underworld, to the criminal element of the Marvel Universe, at least on Earth? Most of those organizations would have ceased to be in less than 3 days' time. I can almost guarantee it. You give Frank Castle access to the same amount of material wealth and material resources as are constantly being handed over to characters like Batman or Iron Man. The tactical mindset that Frank employs that manages to allow him to survive against characters like the fucking Sentinel, for God's sakes. During that War Machine story arc, when he was brainwashed by Hydra, when he broke free of the brainwashing and still had possession of the War Machine suit, he managed to stay one or two steps ahead of Sentry, a character who is supposed to be godlike and right on the verge of omnipotent in the Marvel Universe. And Frank managed to survive and even landed a couple of glancing blows that made the Sentry take a moment to consider this could be a worthy opponent if he had better gear, or if he was not just a frail little human being inside a mechanized suit. Just consider the possibility of what Frank could do with the right gear. Anyway, that's all besides the point. Let's not also overlook the fact that Frank has been clever enough to pull one over on certain far more intelligent characters, or purportedly far more intelligent characters than himself, conversationally. He's obfuscated while talking to Thor, who should be skilled at subtle subterfuge and half truths, dealing with his half brother Loki all the time. Frank has also demonstrated long time strategic thinking and preparation to the point that he has taken on, as I mentioned, the Avengers, including Sentry. But Castle is also a man of strange devotion. During the events of Civil War, he he flat out executes two anti-registration villains who enter the anti-registration base that he is set up shop within to assist Captain America and his anti-reg group. Um, and then Captain America, after he witnesses Frank murder these two people who are villains, Cap just starts to wail on him mercilessly. And Frank doesn't lift a hand in his own defense because he admires and respects what Captain America stands for. And he even acknowledges him as his superior officer in military rank. Though no longer a Marine, Frank Castle still sees Captain America as outranking him, and he will not betray that military code of conduct, service, and structure. He serves under Captain America in that team. He therefore will not raise a hand against his superior on this particular mission. And this proves out often in his connection to Colonel Nick Fury as well. Though Castle isn't one to just take orders anymore from anyone, he does do a lot of favors for Nick Fury. One of the few people in the Marvel Universe who sees Frank Castle as still having value. To that end, the Shield operative once made an observation that perfectly sums up the absolute horror of unleashing an unrestrained Punisher. Quote from Nick Fury: Drop the Hulk at one end of Latveria and Frank Castle at the other end, and tell them to meet in the middle. Honestly, I'm not sure who does more damage or takes more lives before they are through. In his pursuit of brutal justice and satisfaction of his own ends, the Punisher has gone off the deep end more than one time, causing a moderate amount of damage to uninvolved or unwilling participants. Yes, he has caused collateral damage. He has often been shown to feel a great remorse for this, and for these wounds, however, that he has inflicted. But as ever, he understands that he can't just shut down on the mission. The spandex crowd, after all, never seems all too concerned with doing anything to really crack down on street level drug dealers, arms merchants, or pimps in the mortal human world, as referred to earlier with the story arc The Slavers. And this is another source of Frank's seemingly limitless anger and menace. With a world full of superpowered entities, why is it that the lowest kind of scum always seem to float just under their radar? Why is Spider Man retrieving priceless inventions from the lizard's grasp in Manhattan, but overlooking the guy selling kitty porn out of his pawn shop? Why are Xavier's X-Men fighting Magneto when they could join forces with the Master of Magnetism? They've done it before to round up all the firearms in crime-riddled areas and reduce needless casualties. These are thoughts and ideas that have been posed by Frank throughout his various comic storylines. Um, just gonna go ahead and pop the bookmark here. But there's also the concept of balance in the Marvel Universe, and this will be the last point I make about Frank for tonight's show. Um, it is remarked by Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme, in an issue of his comic line. Um, he's talking to Iron Fist, who has recently had a run in with Frank. And Iron Fist asks Doctor Strange, why doesn't somebody just take this guy out? Why doesn't just somebody just do away with him? We don't need people like him out there sullying the good names of superheroes. And Doctor Strange just kind of goes, hey, wait a minute, son. Think about this. The universe is composed of various energies, and those energies must be maintained in a fine tuned balance. Frank Castle is a walking ball of war and rage. And he concentrates it all down into his human form. We know another creature who walks this planet that is fueled by rage and fury. And the more rage and fury that creature feels, the more uncontrollable and destructive his tendencies end up. And Iron Fist is kind of confused. And he's like, wait a minute, are you talking about? And Doctor Strange says, yes, the Hulk. The Hulk is fueled by rage and fury. If you were to get rid of Frank Castle, if he dies, the energy, the power of his rage has to go somewhere. It has to be dispersed into the universe in which we live. And it will be drawn to the next largest source or magnet for rage. Who's that going to be, Iron Fist? Who could it be other than the Hulk? If you take all that fury that Frank Castle walks around with every day and you put it in the Hulk, we will all die because nothing short of the creator of the universe itself will be able to stop it. And now, when you say you compare him to Bruce, Galen, are you mean that's why you compare Frank to Bruce? Because of that simmering rage? Okay. And we've touched upon that a few times before. And again, I am sadly behind on my reread of Song of Ice and Fire, but I don't think you were here last night in the show when I brought up my A Song of Ice and Fire notebook, Galen. Just to let you know, I am going to get back into rereading those books and taking my analytical notations. And eventually we'll have to compare notes when it comes to these notations because I've got a lot down here already for just book one. I'm not too far in my notes into book two. No, Clash of Kings book two. I've only got maybe 10 or 11 pages of notes on. Um, but I've got plenty of notes and things to cover from the first book. At some point, we'll get to this. But anyhow, thinking I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here in a couple of minutes. Um, but yes, I'll have to get back to refreshing myself on the material. If there are any comments, questions, concerns, and take a couple minutes just to sit here quietly and see anything that comes in. And you see, I think the primary difference there, Galen, if I recall correctly, is what motivates Bruce Bolton as opposed to what motivates Frank Castle. Your intention, your motive, is just as important to what you're doing as what you actually do. Um, like the what motivates Reese Bolton to be the be the brutal person that he is, and what motivates Frank to be the brutal person he is, will inform their methodology. And yes, they both want to end the cycle of constant violence and takeover, the bloodshed, the needless suffering of the little people. They want that to be over with, to be concluded. Roos wants to get there by just clearing the boards of everyone. Everyone. Whether they be guilty or innocent, young or old, powerful or powerless, Roos doesn't care. In his view, from my perspective, the most surefire way to make sure to end this ongoing perpetual cycle is to just get rid of everyone, flatten the land under blood. Whereas Frank's methodology goes more along the lines of protect the powerless, destroy the abusive powerful, line the streets with their guts, eliminate them utterly, train the weak and the powerless on how to protect themselves and defend themselves so that the next time some tyrant fucker comes around and messes with them, they can deal with the problem themselves. Frank would rather eliminate the wicked ones who are there right now and train, instruct, and teach those who are currently powerless how to have just enough power to defend and protect themselves and their own in order to maintain balance and equilibrium. Roos would just say, You want an equal, or you want a level playing field. We'll do it by making sure everyone's dead on the ground. Whereas Frank just wants to make sure everyone has the capacity for it. Because when everyone's able to kill each other at the drop of a hat, nobody wants to be the first one to pull that trigger. I think that's where Frank's perspective I find more agreeable than Roos's. But anywho, that is a conversation that you and I suspect, will be able to have a great time picking up at another point. For now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I've been rambling on quite some time again, but that's all for me for tonight. Just wanted to talk some characters, talk a little development, go through a little bit of my process, explain how it is I construct my stories, and talk about Frank Castle. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to this diatribe. For their given narratives, yes. For Frank's especially, I'm less sympathetic to Roos right now, but that's only because my memory of the Song of Ice and Fire novels is not perhaps as good as it will be once I do a reread through of those books. I may end up thinking Roos might have the right idea, particularly given that some of the characters in those books are just, they succeed and I don't feel like they should. Um, but once again, I know I'm repeating myself, but thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask as always that you take care of yourselves and always remember, folks, keep reading. And Galen, I'll continue chit chatting with you kind of through Discord after the show a little bit, I think. Hey, Tiny Panda, you're hopping in just as I'm signing off. Sorry about that. Um, but yeah, I imagine there would be a streak of sympathy for Roos. Like he would understand, okay, I get why you want to do this, but the way you're going about it is all wrong. Um, Anyhow, again, I'm gonna go ahead and hop off for the time being for tonight. Cheers, ladies and gentlemen.